Right, we are on YouTube.
Great.
So while we're waiting, how do we prefer to run questions here? Do you want questions throughout, or shall I sort of narrate and then we'll revisit?
So usually how we do it is we save questions for the end of the talk, but it's worked as well. If you'd like to have a pause for questions, we could do that too. But if you prefer to just take questions throughout, I'm happy for you to do that. Just usually we'd save them for the end or either at the end and kind of a little break in the middle.
Okay.
We find that works best.
Okay.
But as I said, if you prefer to do it another way, I mean, because people, so how we do it is people either type their question into the chat in full and I can just read out the question for them, or if they type the word question in, then they can unmute themselves and properly ask the question themselves using their microphone. So there won't be any interruptions across the talk anyways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Unless you prefer that people can ask questions throughout and then they can just type in and I can cut across and interrupt, if that would work better for you. But
yeah, I guess if they're typing questions while I'm talking, and obviously there's going to be some pretty obvious breaks, I guess.
Okay.
At every sort of transition from one job to another, that's going to be really, it's going to be pause for breath. Go, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can just make it clear in the intro that there'll be opportunities for questions kind of at intervals throughout the talk and at the end. So if people just use the chat function and
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gone 3:05 now, so I think we might just get started. So hi everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Growing Up in Science event. My name's Tara, I'm the co-president of the Cortex Club, and I'm delighted to be hosting Professor Mark Humphries here with us today from the University of Nottingham. So before we begin, I'll just go through some technical aspects of the Zoom call. So firstly, we ask you to mute your microphone for the duration of the seminar, so as not to interrupt the speaker. By attending our online events, you consent to the distribution of images resulting from the event for promotion purposes on Cortex Club social platforms and our website. If you are concerned about your privacy, we remind you that you can change your name displayed in the video call and chat, and also hide your webcam. There will be a time to ask questions at intervals throughout the chat and also at the end of the chat. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can type the word question into the chat, and I will call on you to ask your question at the appropriate time. If you would prefer not to use your microphone or you're having microphone problems, you can type your full question into the chat and I will read the question for you. So Growing Up in Science is a conversation series featuring personal narratives of becoming and being a scientist with a focus on unspoken challenges of a life in science. It was started in 2014 at New York University and it's now worldwide. So at a typical Growing Up in Science event, a scientist shares their journey with a focus on obstacles and struggles, detours. And so we're delighted to welcome Professor Mark Humphries today. Professor Humphries is the Chair of Computational Neuroscience at the University of Nottingham. Prior to starting his group in Nottingham in 2018, Professor Humphries did his PhD and subsequently postdoctoral work at the University of Sheffield with Kevin Gurney. He then spent time as a research fellow at the ENS in Paris and at the University of Manchester. He has also founded the medium publication The Spike in 2016, where his stories reached over 500,000 readers in the first 2 years alone. And there he has written articles on neuroscience, the politics of science, and also guidance for students on pursuing PhDs in neuroscience. He's also written a book that will be published next year, The Spike. And so that is sort of the short version of his background, but there's a lot more to the story than that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Humphries and we can begin.
Cool. So thank you, Tara. Thank you for the invitation to speak. Hello, everybody. Behind the names I can see on the screen. So hopefully a nice, relaxing way to finish off a Friday at the end of the week. Just hear me talking a little bit about where I've been and what I've been doing and the roadblocks on the way. So I guess when I normally start talking about my career, I normally start with pointing out that I never wanted to be an academic, but here I am. So I'm going to tell you the story of how someone gets absorbed into academia despite having no desire whatsoever to be an academic, and how I very much did it in the wrong way. In particular, how I end up staying in the same place for a very long time, which is the antithesis of how you're supposed to be sort of moving around in academia. So I'll just recap the brief CV version that Tara went over, and I'll then go through the detours that happened on that way. So as Sarah said, so I did my PhD. I started my PhD in 1998 at the University of Sheffield with Kevin Gurney. We did 3 years there. Officially, that ended in 2001. I started a postdoc in 2002, also at University of Sheffield. That evolved into a second postdoc there, which then finally came to an end in 2009. So almost 7 years in Sheffield, where I then went to Paris to the Group for Neural Theory with Boris Gutkin, Sophie Deneve, and Christian Machens, and joined them there at École Normale Supérieure, which I still can't say right despite being there for 3 years. École Normale Supérieure, excuse my French. So we went there for 3 years, and there I had a sort of independent fellowship position. That ended in 2012 when I took up my MRC Senior Non-Clinical Fellowship, which is always a mouthful, up in Manchester. So moved back from Paris to Manchester. Spent nearly 6 years there, and then moved to Nottingham finally in Easter 2018. And there we took up a newly created chair in computational neuroscience. So obviously been there ever since. So that's the CV version, right? So you read the top of my CV, then that's the path it goes. Nice linear. There we go. PhD, postdoc, fellowship, chair. So obviously, I'm going to tell you now how that straight line is full of spaghetti. I guess the first place to start is sort of the prehistory of how I even got to that PhD. And I guess one of the key things in the way that I've dealt with sort of academia as it's gone is that I was very much a first gen student, and so I was the first of my entire broad family on both sides to go to university. So we had no idea what to expect obviously when I got there, which meant that everything after going to university was completely new to me and everybody in my family. So it's been an interesting learning experience. So and obviously I'd vaguely had in mind throughout my childhood that I would be some kind of scientist. I always really loved chemistry, so I got chemistry sets for Christmas and loved just pouring chemicals into each other to see what would happen. Mostly what you end up with is brown liquid if you do that. But nonetheless, sort of the idea of discovering stuff was there. And I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to be, I wouldn't really know that there was jobs that there were jobs that were like research scientists, didn't know they existed, because never having no one been to university, you don't have any idea that these things exist. So by the time I got to the end of towards the end of schooling, I had a vague idea that I wanted to be a chemical engineer, so use this chemistry knowledge to do something in industry, kind of scientific, earn a decent wage. So to do that, my eclectic collection of A levels, my last the last exams in the UK that we take at the end of our schooling. So I had chosen geography, maths, and chemistry, which was quite an odd combination. Partly because I was good at those three things early in my career, but as it turned out, A-level chemistry was incredibly boring, and I was really, really shit at it, or really crap. So there's no way I was going to score a good grade in chemistry. So obviously that kiboshed the idea of chemical engineering, But at this point, I'd already had been looking around at different universities to go to, and I was quite keen on somewhere in North. So we lived in Bedford, which is just north of London, and I was quite keen to go further north to one of the big cities further north. So Sheffield was on the list, Leeds was on the list, Manchester was there, and Nottingham too. So I happened to have the catalogue of courses, degrees that are offered by Sheffield. I flicking through it to find some other ideas other than chemical engineering. And it just so happened that also in the C section was cognitive science, which I'd never heard of, as had none of my classmates. And partly that turned out because there are only 3 cognitive science degrees, I think, ever offered in this country, one in Sheffield, one in Edinburgh, and one in Sussex. And none of those exist anymore. So, and that sounded really cool. So cognitive science, as it was described in the catalogue, was it's a mixture of psychology and computer science, of AI and robotics, of philosophy, and all sorts of other bits besides. So, so that particularly appealed because I had some interest in some really naive folk interest in the mind and the brain, and I also always had fun with computers. So I was of a generation where, when we were kids, it was the Commodore and Spectrum generation. So you had these computers you could easily program in BASIC. We had the Commodore 16 to play on. So not the Commodore 64, which is the good one. We had the Commodore 16, which had a whole 16 kilobytes of memory. So programming that to do anything was an art. So that helped my efficient coding, particularly in BASIC. So I had some, I've been playing with coding since I was a kid, like computers. So this cognitive science degree seemed to be perfect, a merging of coding and bits of artificial intelligence and bits of all sorts of other stuff I didn't know about. So signed up for that. It proved to be exactly as much as a sort of a mishmash as it sounded. So we ended up doing a whole bunch of psychology modules. So, I've sat through modules on social psychology, on the theory of planned behavior, and all sorts of stuff that I can't no longer remember, health psychology and stuff. And throughout the sort of the first couple of years of that degree, it was quite, I'll say to be polite, my grades were variable. So it varied wildly with my sort of engagement with the module course I was on. But then suddenly in the third year of the degree, it suddenly finally clicked into place. Maybe many of you found this. So it's also the first 2 years of your degree are obviously about establishing a foundation, and so in the third year that your lecturers, your faculty, really let you in on the sort of the stuff, more the cutting edge of the actual stuff that's happening, that's exciting in science right now. And that's really when it clicked for me. So I enjoyed pretty much everything that we did that year, and particularly, of course, like in most third years. Last year of degree, you had the research project. So I did my research project with Paul Dean, who was a pretty eminent sort of psychologist, neuroscientist, mostly interested in cerebellum. Indeed, did some work with David Marwell when he was alive. And but he's offering an undergraduate project on the amygdala for some reason. He read a paper was interested in, a little model of the amygdala. So I got to build my very first computational model in my third year research project. Learn about synaptic plasticity and about fear conditioning, about how the amygdala might learn to associate stimuli and tones to make a memory of fear. And that sort of convinced me that, well, this is really, really cool. So if there was a way of doing this kind of modeling, computational modeling work as a career, that would be fantastic. But obviously all through the degree, I was having the usual undergraduate ruminations about, what should I do as a career next? And most people were my course were the same. So because our course was so eclectic, because it was psychology and coding and AI and neural networks and philosophy and statistics, and we did some discrete math stuff. It's all over the place. So some of my classmates went off to do. They were more classic psychology stuff. They went off to do advertising and marketing and human resources and stuff. Some of them went to join the games companies to go and do artificial intelligence programming. Some of them went off to start web design companies. Bearing in mind, this is 1997, 98, when the web was really just exploding. It's just before the dot-com bubble first burst in 99. So this was a unheard of of a career to go and do web design as a thing. And But I was scratching my head and thinking, well, I like coding, so maybe, you know, something fairly dull, maybe I don't know, IT consultant, maybe pays well, interesting projects. Because at this point, I hadn't really clicked for me that there was even such a thing as a PhD. Right? So again, because obviously none of my family are academic anyway. Both my parents left school at 16, so we had no knowledge of the sort of the world beyond the degree existed. Until I think it was Peter Redgrave in Sheffield sat me down and had a chat about sort of how the chats about how research works. The fact that, you know, you can do a PhD and it's like you'll be well qualified to do one. I seem to remember the only prior person mentioning to me the existence of a PhD was my middle school home economics teacher, Mrs. Pendleton, who happened to be married to a physics lecturer. So she also took us for science as well as home economics, because, you know, those two are the same thing, right? It's just mixing chemicals together and stirring it around. One makes cakes, one makes explosions. So that was the only time before that someone had ever mentioned to me the idea of you know, having this thing as a PhD as a way of doing sort of a career after your undergraduate studies. So I ended up being offered a PhD at Reading, which I was just about to take. So and then a very late offer came from Kevin Gurney at Sheffield to go and do a PhD with him on the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, we had covered this chunk of midbrain and forebrain. We had covered in great detail in one of our lectures in the course. They were really fascinating to sound like a really good idea. And in retrospect, it's probably the wise decision, because the only thing I remember about the offer from Reading was that the lecturer's office who was making me the offer was stacked floor to ceiling with like papers everywhere, and was just a bomb site of stuff. I think anytime you see sort of that level of classic academic disarray, is probably not a good sign about their supervision capabilities, probably. So having got this offer of a PhD studentship from Sheffield out of the blue, decided to stay in Sheffield. And why not? Because it turned out I like Sheffield quite a lot. So Sheffield's a strange little city in the UK. It's not somewhere you'd go as a tourist. It hasn't got many sights to see, but it's a very lovely place to live. Indeed, famously, Sheffield University prides itself on the fact that it has the highest retention rate of any university in the country. So there are more people who stay in Sheffield after leaving their degree than finishing university than any other city in the UK, with the possible exception of London, obviously. Okay, so PhD. So that's where we kicked off with the official CV. Right? So the PhD with Kevin was officially about computational models of the basal ganglia. So these chunks of brain, you know, the striatum is in the forebrain, and the bits underneath it, the globus pallidus, subthymic nucleus. Some of you guys may know this, some of you may not. So these chunks of brain obviously are damaged in Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, and all sorts of disorders. And there's a line of research at Sheffield which was interested in how this collection of brain nuclei are involved in all these different movement and thought disorders. And maybe that the universal theory of what they do is that they are a mechanism which decides what you're going to do next. It's the mechanism which does action selection. So as in they're listening to the whole of cortex, which is coming up with all sorts of things you could be doing next. That's all being funneled through this basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia, because this is tiny, really tight funnel to the tiny output structures. Those output structures send out inhibition everywhere to stop things happening. And maybe what they're doing is you turn off the inhibition a little bit on the output, and then you select the thing that corresponds to that output. That's the action to do next. So that was a theory in words. So essentially the goal of the thesis was to make computational models of this process and show that it really could happen, and explore the basal ganglia in a computational model form. And needless to say, I guess that many of you have found that the PhD was a tough process, particularly at the start. So at the start, there was no there's no PhD program. It was just a one-off studentship I'd been offered, and there was no other computational postdocs or PhDs of any kind, because it was at that point. So it was literally just me, and there's me in a little office at the end of a long corridor, being handed some papers to read and a vague remit to see if the first remit was to work out whether how the basal ganglia output could control the input from the whisker pathway in a rodent, to think about how basal ganglia may control sensory sort of based decisions. So a few months of reading was enough to show that the basal ganglia has actually nothing to do with the whisker pathway whatsoever. So that was a total dead end. So the first 5 months of my PhD, I just threw on a bonfire and we started again. Mostly my PhD process was basically Kevin finding an interesting problem, going, why don't we work on this? And working on that for a while, and then saying, and then finding another problem, working on that instead, and finding another problem, working on that instead. So there was no point where there was a cohesive sort of overarching plan other than the vague idea of let's build models of the basal ganglia. Needless to say, without sort of this sort of cohesive plan, and as someone who honestly, as computational modeling draws heavily on maths of all kinds, and my last sort of really deep form mathematical education was at the end of school, because at A-level maths, because also my degree itself had bits of maths in it, but not deep in sort of differentiation, numerical methods, and the kind of stuff we need for models. Obviously, I constantly felt out of my depth, and being the only student working on this stuff, there wasn't anyone else really to converse with. So the coding side of building models went okay. So we could build the models and simulate them. That was fine. So we can sort of simulate and get some results out. But it meant that obviously the deeper we got into the PhD process, and the more working on these models and the more papers I was reading and not really understanding, obviously at that point, this is sort of classic imposter syndrome type territory, right? You're thinking, how can I possibly be a computational modeler when I can't do the math stuff? And so that was sort of turning me off the idea of going any further with research. And then what was really turning off sort of going any further with the research was watching my supervisor try and publish his first model of the basal ganglia. So they'd already sort of built this thing when I started. So when I started in '98, they already had a full, I was handed this 50-page technical report which detailed this model in great detail about sort of all the background information about all the anatomy, all the ideas about how the circuit inside wired together could form this selection circuit, about all the maths that proved that it worked, and then all the simulations that showed that it worked. And the idea was to take that technical report, take a paper out of it and publish it. And by the end of my thesis research period, 3 years later, the paper still hadn't been published. It was still stuck in review hell. It had been gone to various, they tried it at the high level journals because they thought this is a big breakthrough in basal ganglia theory, and also get knocked back again, and down and down and down it went. So watching him struggle to publish this, and watching him struggle to occasionally, even in those sort of slightly less pressure days of the late 90s, still struggling to get grants in, and cursing that, meant that I didn't have wasn't particularly sort of enthused as an idea of taking on research as a career. And indeed, at that time, I was more into playing music, really. So sort of throughout the student days and PhD days, I was in various not very good bands. But obviously being in those bands and playing guitar and playing rehearsal like once or twice a week was more interesting and motivating than particularly by the end of the second year of my PhD, the classic sort of PhD blues phase, than doing the research. So we got to the point, so what we're talking about now. So that's sort of about sort of the money was officially due to run out in sort of summer 2001. And by the time the money had run out, I hadn't finished writing the thesis. So I was also into my writing up period at that point. So I spent a few months unemployed trying to write up the thesis, and in the September, sort of literally 2 weeks after the money officially ran out, I discovered that in one of my core chapters, obviously there's a key line of maths. The key line of maths in this whole basal ganglia structure, which is that this tiny structure called subthymic nucleus, it excites the structure called the globus pallidus, right? It has a connection going into its excitatory, but there's a feedback inhibitory connection from the globus pallidus. This beautiful negative feedback loop in the middle of this structure. And that's where lots of the exciting dynamics in the basal ganglia come from, this feedback loop. And I discovered, well, working back through some code that I was rerunning to get some results, that in one of the codes I had written, the connection from the subthymic nucleus of globus pallidus had got a plus sign, had a minus sign rather than a plus sign. So it was inhibiting rather than exciting the structure, which rather radically changed the dynamics of the structure. So this error basically denoisely had propagated through the code that had been written after that, despite various checks on that code. And it meant that about a third of the work that's supposed to go in the thesis then had to be scrapped and thrown away and redone from scratch, starting after the money had run out. So I then spent 2 months working flat out, essentially just doing nothing else except just working to rebuild all the results, check everything was still working fine, and also find the new results that had come out of the correctness error and checking they were fine, interpreting them, writing all my thesis chapters again. So I did that in 2 months, obviously, working every single day, working like 10, 11 hours a day. Obviously, can you imagine at that point, having this, then I got the final draft of the thesis and handed it in to Kevin just before Christmas 2001, and was heartily sick of the whole thing. So, So at that point, I indeed, yay blunders, I can see the chat. So at that point, obviously I decided, okay, I'm leaving academia now. This is not for me. So we got any questions, by the way, at this point, when I'm about to transition from my PhD sob story into something slightly more upbeat?
I have a question, just because you mentioned about imposter syndrome. Was that specifically at the start of your PhD, or did it kind of continue throughout? And what do you think were sort of the sources of that for you?
I would say that it was a fairly linear increase over my PhD. It's a classic, sort of uncanny valley effect, right? You at the start, you don't know what you don't know. It's utterly clueless. So as you are getting deeper into the literature and realizing just how fantastically brilliant some of the other people's work is, and how you can't imagine doing that, as the layers come apart, and you sort of think, you look at these models and look at some of these solutions people come up with, and get all this creativity in science and go, this is just amazing stuff. I cannot see how to get from where I am to where they are. It was a kind of and so it's just an increase of that feeling. Not then helped by finding errors in your work, and no one, particularly at that point, late 90s, none of these kind of things existed where we talk about our errors in our our careers. So it was I assumed then that errors that I made were entirely reflecting my failings and faults as a scientist, and when I wouldn't be able to then we're not up to the standard of sort of published work. So it was like a constant increase.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. Okay, Gemma has a question. Gemma, would you like to unmute the microphone?
Yeah, sure. Hey, my question is basically, do you have any advice for when you find kind of errors like that in code, or like silly mistakes you found out that you've done? Do you have any advice on how to like deal with that and like kind of get over it and just carry on?
Yeah. So I should. That's a good point. I'll jump sort of. That is by far from the only error I've ever found in my code, or indeed other people's code. Right. So, it took me a while to learn because I was doing it mostly on my own. But it much helps when you're dealing with a whole bunch of people coding together. So it's a much happier time later when I was in Sheffield. We had a whole group of people around me, so we had lots of everyone's coding skills exploded exponentially when you've got a lot of people to bounce stuff off, and a lot of people to check stuff with. But what you learn mostly from coding a lot is that all code has errors in it. No matter how brilliant the coder, all code has errors in it. What you hope is that error is not somewhere that's critical. And so the error is in that you've forgotten to initialize a variable properly, and it doesn't matter because it got overwritten in the for loop anyway, so that's fine. So there's, and also there are various ways of catching errors, right? So any time you're writing a piece of code that is critical to what you're doing, it's a good practice, obviously, to write tests for it so that you check that the output is making sense, and you graph some results, and you fiddle with the numbers and make sure that when you turn something down, that the results go down or whatever, so that it all flows logically. I have to say that this is quite prescient in my team, because I've just started a formal process of code review in my lab about 3 months ago, because we had another project derailed where a line of code right at the start of a sort of thousands of lines of code was another error like that sort of connection sign error that I had, which is more of a conceptual error. As an error you'll never catch from testing the code, unless you absolutely already know what the output will look like 100%. Because it's just a conceptual error. You just transcribed something wrong, or you made a wrong decision about how you're going to do something. So I had this huge pile of data analysis code written by someone a long time ago in my lab, in which they made some really random choice which didn't appear in any write-up or any methods, dug into the code, found this line, and realized it changed everything going forward. So we have just started in the lab a code review process where now people present chunks of their code, and we go through it line by line. And we're doing that then for bits of code like this, which are mission critical to everything that goes after it, so that you can be sure that they're built on solid foundations. I'd say generally, when we have code errors, the fixes have generally been straightforward and have great much work, where they've been, all right, we found this problem, change it to what's supposed to be, regenerate the graph. There we go, it's done, it's finished. Yeah, it's only very occasionally that it's slightly more catastrophic. Yeah, and obviously there've been far worse examples, right? I mean, there was the famous example of there was a team of crystallographers at Stanford who published, I think, 2 Science and 1 Nature paper on the sort of growth, the trees of growth of crystals, that turned out to be completely wrong, because the code had a minus sign, we're supposed to have a plus sign, same as my code, and it inverted the structure. So they pulled all these 2 Science and Nature papers from a single line of code that were, so yeah, it could be much worse.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Oh, Alexandra?
There's one more question in the chat. Alexandra, would you like to unmute?
Hi everyone. Hi, Mark. Well, a bit different question. Well, regarding to the freedom of a PhD student when she or he is doing a project or a hypothesis, or find a way on a specific field that most of the times happen in the PhD years. So actually, during a PhD, there are usually 2 ways to continue. The first is to come up with a well-defined project, already designed and conceptualized by seniors, by the supervisor of the project, and show the student it's like sometimes a technician and not a researcher, because for me research does not mean only doing the experiment on doing the model, creating the model, but also that the training of the early stage researcher to challenge herself or himself and try to design, try to conceptualize, try to find out some questions. So what is your suggestion for early stage scientists like PhD students that are willing to go a defined project a bit step further and are willing to challenge themselves and try to make some new designs and want the freedom to do something a bit different when the advisor says no to this. What do you think? Should the PhD student fight for it if he strongly believes in an idea?
That's a good question. So let me try and give a concise answer. So in any PhD, there's a tension between, say, having the ability to the time and the freedom to learn how to be a researcher, right? To follow your follow research paths, find dead ends, use your own creativity to drive research on the one hand, and the tension between that and the fact that you have a hard time limit and you need to be able to be actually drilled in the basics of doing science, of actually doing sort of if experiments, actually doing the experiments, doing them well, logging the data properly, keeping your lab book up to date, making sure everything is working, all the sort of basic stuff you need to do to make sure you have some kind of science that's ongoing. So you have this tension between the sort of the need to have a sort of structured thing that's going to let you get a PhD, and the need to be able to train you in this, in the freedom of what science is supposed to be. So any PhD is going to be somewhere on those scales. So it's always tricky as a supervisor to make a judgment call about someone comes to you with they want to go down a certain direction, and inherently it's going to be difficult to guess quite how difficult or how much time or how much resources that idea is going to take up. So it's often going to be a gut instinct call about, okay, I don't think we should do this because it feels like it's going to be a thing that's going to take up a huge amount of resources, but it's going to give you nothing, and give you nothing in a practical sense. That if it's a huge time write-off from the thing that could go into your thesis, then it's going to, it's a problem. But you're quite right that it's no good having a micromanaged PhD where you come in and you get given a list of things to do like this day one, and you just step through them. Yes, but then to get through either a theoretical experimental PhD, you have to be given some kind of structure to be able to say, here's where you start, here's where you're going to go next. So this is roughly where we're going to go. And I guess the ideal situation, again, one I try and set up for my students is that the beginning is fairly structured, right? You're just going to start reading this, you're going to do a lit review on that, you're going to try and implement this, and then the overall question we'll have is this broad question here, and how we get from where we are now to that question answer, I don't know. So we're going to start structured and expand out after that. Mm-hmm. But I guess as theorists, we have a little bit more flexibility, right? Of be able to play with stuff and put it down if it's not working. Whereas for the experimental side, it's a bit more of an investment of your time and resources. If you want to go, I want to do these experiments, and that doesn't work, that's going to be more of a serious problem. So yeah, I'd say it was a balance of, if the students got the great ideas and they're really committed, then trying to convince the supervisor that it's to go against their gut feeling of why you think it's not going to be a time sink that's going to take away from the ultimate goal of getting you your thesis.
So it's about the balance.
Yeah, definitely about the balance. It's tough.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We have one more question in the chat for now, and then maybe we'll continue and take more questions later on. That's okay?
Yeah.
Juan, would you like to?
Yeah.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Juan.
So I was listening to you, and a lot of what you were saying resonated a lot with my own experience as well, and discovering very late that there's a possibility to have a career as a scientist. So I was just gonna ask about how do you think the way academia works, in a way, it makes it even harder for like lower income students, because the way you structure, sometimes there's the expectation that you can spend a year unemployed to write a thesis, and that's something that everyone can and should do, when sometimes that's really a big disadvantage, and sometimes you have to be of a particular economic position to be able to stay long enough in academia to actually get some of these opportunities and not just quit as soon as you don't have the next paycheck, because yeah, you're living by the month. So I don't know what was your, has anything changed, or do we keep this structure precisely because not a lot of people like us even consider this as a career?
I think in some areas it's got worse. Not least because a lot of areas in a lot of biomedical science and psychology, a lot of recruitment to PhDs is based on CVs where you now expect people to have internships and research experience during a degree. But if you've got no good economic background, you can't afford to do these internships over summer. You've got to go and get a job. So I'm concerned that it's getting worse, not better, in terms of access to PhD programs, because of the sort of ever increasing requirements of the applicants to show how good they are to get on the PhD program in the first place. It's of benefit if you can take unpaid time to go and do a research project in your summer. Yeah, and it is. So yeah, personally, yes, there was a couple of times. Yeah, so I was unemployed for 4 or 5 months, and it was only because I was very lucky at that point. So I had just moved in with my girlfriend, now wife. So she was covering the rent on the flat. Obviously, I had nothing coming in at all. And then another, 3 years later, at the end of my first postdoc, I was also then unemployed for a couple of months because all the money ran out in the grant. So I was, obviously scratching together what little money I had saved over the postdoc to keep me going a couple of months until we got some bridging funding and carried on. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. So maybe we can keep going now. And
yeah. Cool. All right, I'll pick up the pace a little bit. So, all right. So the end of a PhD, handed the thesis in. I then sort of left academia. So what I went off and did, I did some freelancing software consultancy, software design stuff, and I did some web design. And the software consultancy stuff was with a company called Dyslexia, Dyspraxia, and Attention Treatment Centers, which was this brainchild of this of Winfried Dorr, who was a millionaire, who has founded a series of centers for treating and diagnosing dyslexia because his daughter had really severe dyslexia and had led her to have really serious depression. So he took all his money he earned from creating a brand of fireproof paint that he sold to ICI, and created this enormous network of centers around the country. And I was pulled into this project through a contact to go and write all the analysis code for their stuff they were using to diagnose dyslexia. Then did some web design, and needless to say, these jobs paid a little bit better than academia, but they're all completely self-employed and freelancing. And both the jobs that I had up to that, the sort of freelance jobs I got were from contacts I already had, sort of friends and friends of friends. And it also became clear that if I was going to carry on doing that as a career, then I would need to do lots of networking and set myself up properly and go to lots of conferences and network with lots of people. And at that point, I would say I was considerably sort of shyer and more introverted than I am now. And that filled me with slight horror. And then out of the blue, sort of mid 2002, I got a phone call from Kevin Gurney, my old PhD boss in Sheffield, and said, "We just got a grant come through. We have a postdoc on it. Would you be interested in this postdoc?" So chatted about it with the missus and decided to apply and got it. So I ended up back in academia. Not for any great desire to be back in academia, but because I couldn't quite work out how I would sustain a career as a freelancer when I wasn't someone who's naturally sort of at ease networking. So I went back to took basically a year off, but then came back by accident really, and picked up a 3-year postdoc in Sheffield, supposedly working on models of the brainstem at this point. But if anything, my postdoc with who the official supervisor was Tony Prescott in Sheffield, the postdoc was even less structured in its supervision than the PhD. So I ended up working on network theory stuff and dopamine and lots of basic ganglia stuff. And we still did some brainstem models too, but it got very, very sort of many projects. that's kind of the point where I sort of really spread my wings and got involved in lots of different areas of research, many of which only paid off many years sort of down the line. So that was a 3-year postdoc. As I just sort of said, answering Juan's question, the money ran out on that before we had any sort of, there was a big grant that had gone in to the EU framework projects that we're hopeful was kind of come off. And I'd written a chunk of that and I was named on it. So I was unemployed for a couple of months, and then I part-time, and then I had a couple of months bridging funding, and grant got funded. So I was back on the saddle again as a postdoc again in Sheffield, because obviously I'd written part of the grant, I was named on it. And there was this big EU Framework 6 grant. So these Framework 6 grants, this was one of these IP grants, and that meant that it had 10 different institutions involved from across Europe. So there was 8 universities and 2 companies. One was BAE Systems in Bristol, one was Cyberbotics in Lausanne in Switzerland. And like all these massive grants, it was unwieldy and chaotic and absurdly ambitious, right? So it's called the IKEA project, ICEA. The project lead was in Sweden, obviously. And it was supposed to stand for Integrating Cognition, Emotion, and Autonomy, which is essentially everything that you need to be a complex living creature, right? So cognition, emotion, and autonomy is basically the whole brain. So the project was basically to build the whole brain. Needless to say, because you've never read any of the papers about it, it didn't happen. But it meant we got to meet sort of, obviously, lots of interesting labs from across Europe, lots of experimental labs doing neuroscience experiments, lots of the other sort of theory labs around Europe. Lots of robotics stuff from British Aerospace and the Bristol Robotics Laboratory. So the whole mix. And I was also heavily involved in that. So I ended up, these big European grants have work packages, which is like the collection of the teams that are working on a particular problem. And I was put in charge of one of those work packages. So I had to coordinate 5 teams across Europe, and I had to sort out the annual review documents and all the annual updates of the budgets and all that kind of stuff. So I was deeply immersed in running these grants. So obviously by this point, getting quite itchy feet, and I had wanted some point in my first postdoc, I'd realized like the thing that I'd really wanted to do was some kind of personal fellowship. So go to one of the research councils, like the MRC, or in this case, mostly it was EPSRC, because we were doing lots of computational modeling stuff, and get one of their 5-year research fellowships to go and establish my own research program and do exactly what I wanted without the constraints of having to work on someone else's ideas. And so I'd applied for, 10 or 11 of these things while I was in Sheffield, all to no avail. Various of them didn't even get to review. Some of them fell at the very first hurdle. They weren't even taken on by the program manager to be reviewed because they were not in scope. So then this post came up that was in Paris at the GNT, which was advertised as a kind of fellowship-like post. It was, as it turned out, they had the unfortunate problem of having too much money, which is never a problem in academia. But they had secured a bunch of large grants simultaneously, and there was 3 PIs leading the team. So it was Boris Gutkin, Sophie Deneuve, and Christian Machens. And they were swamped with all these PhD students and junior postdocs. There were like 20 odd of them. And they couldn't keep up with the management. So they wanted to bring in someone who would sit in basically in between, some sort of independent fellow type place, come for 3 years, do your own research, and help us basically manage everything that's happening. So I understand the job was fairly fiercely competitive, and I was lucky enough to get it. I don't know why. And it was great. So it was always what I always wanted. Go and have 3 years to go and just do what I establish my own research program, hit the ground running, did a lot of great stuff, and learnt a huge amount there. So Sophie and her Bayesian ideas, Boris and his he does lots of neural dynamic stuff, and Christian Machens, lots of population coding, lots of dimension reduction ideas, whole mixed bag, lots of ideas I've never been exposed to before. And obviously I did it mostly for the science. So it definitely wasn't for the money, because obviously at this point I had moved to Paris to take up this job, and obviously my wife having a full-time job, which paid more than academic salary in Sheffield. So she stayed in Sheffield in our house. So I was paying a rent on a flat in Paris and a mortgage back in Sheffield. So, and then the cost of the Eurostar back and forth between Paris and London and up to Sheffield again every couple of weeks. So that happily absorbed all of my salary. So it certainly wasn't for the cash. And that was going great. And as it turned out, I didn't actually physically spend 3 years in Paris. I actually spent closer to just over half that time there, because our first child was born in June of 2011. So I came back obviously to live in the UK full time, with the blessing of the team in Paris, to see out the rest of my Paris contract in the UK, and doing everything over all sort of discussion meetings and stuff over video, just as we've been doing, you know, for the last 8 months or so. But that meant that from then, so basically from when I came back in May 2011 until September 2012, when I started in Manchester, I was working just entirely at home with a newborn baby in the house. So one thing that obviously that was challenging, but also that meant that obviously got really efficient in my working. So that meant that particularly at the start, obviously I would only be able to work when she slept. So that was, you know, a couple of hours a day here and there. But it really helps you sort of focus on what's really important to do and what can be left. And then I got onto then I was lucky enough to get the MRC fellowship. So again, that was a series of mistakes. Essentially, I had gone back onto the fellowship applications round, trying to get a job after this postdoc in Paris. So I had applied for, I don't know, applied for 4 or 5 lectureship posts in the UK, and had only received interviews for 2 and hadn't gotten either. I had applied for a whole bunch more jobs after that initial round of 5 and got no interviews at all. And getting quite stressed at this point, obviously, because we're coming up to the end of my contract in Paris was looming, and had a new baby and no sort of career ahead of me. So I'd applied to the MRC for a fellowship. It's the first time I'd gone to the MRC, because previously I'd always gone to the EPSRC because we're doing computational modeling. It seemed the obvious one. Someone suggested going to the MRC. Suddenly seemed such a good idea. Meant to just apply for their sort of mid-level fellowship because I didn't feel like I was qualified for anything more. But when I approached them, they said, no, you have to apply for the senior fellowship, the most prestigious one, which lasts for 7 years, because you don't qualify for the intermediate one anymore. So it was by mistake that I applied for the senior one. And then, by some miracle, it was written just after my baby was born, and it turned out okay, and got to the interview. The interview went fantastically. Got a phone call out of the blue in, I think it was April 2012, and I got the fellowship. So that one stroke of luck then changed everything. So that meant that I could then start this new fellowship, this new job in September 2012, which was going to be hosted in Manchester. So I commuted from Sheffield to Manchester, back and forth. And then also Manchester was finally got to relax a little bit for the first time, because 7 years stretching out ahead of me is quite a long time. And so there obviously I was learning to be a PI, all the things that come from learning to be a PI, learning how to recruit people, about how to interview people, about how to manage people, about how to give feedback on papers, about how to do all the things that come with leading a team, which you know nothing about when you're as you're just being a researcher through most of your career. And then the key things that happened in Manchester were that I got my underwrite, the permanent position my position was turned permanent in Manchester in 2015, which was a case of making use of luck. Essentially, 2015, I had 2 papers come out more or less simultaneously in 2 really good journals. So, and they had a little bit of press coverage. So I went to I asked the faculty senior board to have the meeting they're supposed to have about whether to turn my contract permanent or not, to have it now rather than many years in the future. So we had it then. It was signed off after an interview with me. So finally, 2015, my first permanent job. So that was what, 12 and a bit years after starting my first postdoc. I could finally say to my mum that I now had a full-time job, permanent job. And then that led me to sit back a little bit and go, all right, so what else could I be doing with my time? So I remember the feeling of a huge weight was lifted at that point, right? Which is you don't even aware of until it's gone. And then when I could then think about all the things that I would like to do. And so at that point, I revisited the ideas of thinking about science communication, really. So throughout my career, I've been thinking about, often touching the idea of it'd be nice to be able to communicate computational neuroscience more to a broader audience, but I don't have any idea about how to make the stuff that I do interesting to a broad audience, how to convey it well, how to make it interesting. And in some time, when I was thinking about what to do in sort of 2015, it suddenly occurred to me, of course, that I was being a bit dumb. I don't have to talk about my work at all. Of course, I can just talk about anybody's work. I can just communicate great work that's out there in the world that I want to talk about. So I can talk about all this great systems neuroscience that I have, read about and know about. So I started giving public talks, and they were quite fun, but obviously they're quite a small audience. And I decided at that point that I've always really enjoyed writing. So I was as a kid, I wrote many chapter ones. As a kid, started lots of books, never finished any of them, but lots of chapter ones. So I thought, okay, I'll start writing up some like pieces about papers that I enjoy or bits of research that are really cool. I'll put them. I'll post them up somewhere on the internet. I found Medium seemed to be a great place to put them because Medium is this sort of, it's kind of like a blogging platform, but it's completely free from ads, and it's got a beautiful interface, and it's just great. So it's just really easy to use. So I posted up a few things, and this is where we started. So I accidentally ended up starting The Spike, which is, which Tara mentioned at the start, which is this sort of online publication at Medium, which have now been running for 4 and a bit years. So I posted a couple of posts up. A few people read them. The 4th post that I posted up, for some reason, went completely viral. It got picked up on Boing Boing. It was blogged about in some blogs and Science magazine. It went around Twitter twice. So it got so suddenly this huge number of readers appeared for this post. And I thought, okay, well, maybe some people want to read this stuff, so I'll find a place to put it all. So I gathered what little posts I put together and put them on this thing, called it The Spike, to give it a name that would sound like a kind of like a newspaper for neuroscience. And then following all the great advice you normally get about writing, I committed at that point to a schedule of writing. So I committed to myself to writing a new piece every 2 weeks. And I managed to keep that up, I think, for 9 months, I think. So that meant so each piece was at least 1,500 words on either a paper or a new bit or collection of ideas in science, or even something about politics in science, or some stuff about funding and stuff. So that meant that the audience grew and grew and grew, and occasionally one of the pieces, some pieces would have a couple of hundred reads, and some of them would have many tens of thousands. It would just be wildly variable. But the audience then grew and grew. And then, and then one day, email popped through my inbox, one of the rare, exciting ones you get in your inbox, which was from a literary agent saying, "Oh, I read one of your pieces. I think it's fantastic. Have you ever thought about writing a book?" Okay, so we had the agent's based in New York, so we had a video chat about what ideas I had floating around in my head for books. We picked up the one he was most excited about, and we went from there. So that is now the book we have now coming out in March the 2nd, which also called The Spike, which wasn't my title. I have to say. So my title was Eye Spike, because the whole idea is of the book is that it's about following the journey of a spike through the whole brain, from where it starts in the eye, traversing through the entire brain as you're making a decision about whether to pick up something, a cookie on the desk in front of you. So you can traverse through all the visual system, about the object recognition, about where things are in the world, traverse through decision-making, working memory areas, traverse through the motor areas, through the basal ganglia too, to make all that simple decision of, am I going to pick up this cookie or not? Because there's someone looking at me while I'm trying to nick it. And so that's the framework for the whole book. So my agent really felt that calling it The Spike was a bit more declarative, right? And then a subtitle is A Journey Through the Brain in 2.1 seconds. So that's, so I'm happy to talk more about obviously the book writing process, but that was, as I say, a lot more fun than the normal paper writing process, obviously without the harsh reviewing. So the book was written in 9 months last year, from January to September, and that was obviously that was just after I moved to Nottingham, so after the chair opportunity to come up, like I said at the beginning. And I'll end on saying that I'm still feeling like I'm finding my feet. You know? So I've been doing this now for what? It's been 18 years since I started my postdoc. Right? But even in Nottingham, so we turned up to Nottingham, and obviously it's a whole new institution, so I don't know how anything works. We've been here since Easter 2018, but because of, we didn't actually move into our offices in the psychology building until July last year. So we didn't meet anybody that we're supposed to be working with for a year and a bit. We're on the far side of the campus. We finally moved into our offices. Obviously we've been there for 8 months, and we've got all kicked out again because of COVID. So in the 2.5 years I've been in Nottingham, I've actually only been in with my colleagues for 8 months. Still don't know how anything works or where anything is, or the, you know. So still relearning everything and still not sure how everything works. So that feeling doesn't go away no matter how senior you get, but it gets easier, you get to expect it, which is the important thing. You get to know that's going to happen. So it's not a surprise when it happens. Okay, I've wrapped up there because it's taken a lot of your time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark. If we could all give Mark a virtual round of applause. No, people don't want to unmute their microphones. Okay, so if people have any more questions, and I assume that there's lots, they can write them into the chat, and as last time I will call on them to unmute their microphone, or they can just type the question directly into the chat. Okay, there's a question here from Alex. I'm in a very noisy cafe, so he's writing his question out. So first of all, he says, Mark, thank you for the great talk. As someone who has done a similar transition, what would be your advice for someone going from experimental biological work to more computational work in the future? How do you handle the creeping imposter syndrome compared to other people in computational neuroscience coming from quantitative disciplines like math or engineering or physics? Self-learning, perseverance, and fake it till you make it, or are there better strategies? Thanks.
Yeah, all right, good question. So undoubtedly, so those qualities that, as you said, the self-learning and perseverance, they're key, are going to be obviously key, okay, to doing it. But also it's the recognition that it's going to take all sorts of skill sets to make good science. So while, so like me, I don't have a deep, hard quantitative background. I didn't do 3 years of engineering or 3 years of math and physics as a degree. But I bring a huge amount of knowledge that people who did do 3 years of engineering, physics, and so on don't have to the table. So obviously, there is no undergraduate degree in sort of computational neuroscience. There's no, or theoretical neuroscience. There's no undergraduate degree that tries to pull together all the ideas you need to know from neuroscience with all the ideas you need from the math side. So everyone coming into computational neuroscience is lacking knowledge, essential knowledge to be able to do what they do. So the best mathematician can make the most beautiful solution to the equations, and you can say, well, it's interesting, but it's not actually relevant to the brain because you're missing this. So it has to be, all sorts of skills have to come together to make a good computational work. And it's also about finding your niche, right? So there's various levels you can work at. So I myself, I prefer working in sort of various bits. So one way I prefer working is in areas of in silico simulations, right? Simulations that are obviously too big to do any kind of maths with, where you're trying to answer questions about how the biological realism actually impacts the computation that circuit is doing. So there, it's more about skills of coding and analysis of the outputs, rather than having to do sort of deep maths or physics on the equations themselves. Also, of course, you have whole areas which are about simple algorithms like reinforcement learning, where you can get really deep insights from just a smattering of quantitative knowledge, and really good ideas is what drives those things forward. So I think one of the strategies is definitely figure out where you can fit. Right? So if you're really good at absorbing and assimilating lots of knowledge, you can turn all that biological knowledge into a sort of synthesize it into information that's needed for models. So you know a little bit about theory, so you know what kind of information is relevant, so you can feed that in. Or you can find algorithm areas you're happier to play in, or simulation areas you're happier to play in. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's a really good answer. And Alex says thanks as well. Just on the same sort of topic of imposter syndrome again, I just find it interesting that at the start that you said that it increases throughout a PhD, because at the very start of a PhD, you're kind of looking at what other people are doing, thinking that it's so great and wondering, how do I kind of get there and sort of further on the field and advance it? But it's interesting that it increases because, well, I personally am only at the start of my PhD, so I guess I'll know how it goes. But like, when you're kind of sort of in the middle of your PhD and you're kind of getting more competent at, like your research question and sort of your goals and what you're trying to do in the research itself, I would have thought that alone would have made it sort of subside a little bit, that you're making some sort of progress, and that would like kind of make it subside a little bit and mellow it a little bit, but maybe that's not the case. So it's interesting.
Actually, so yes, you're right that particularly in your PhD, once you've got your feet under the table and you've got through the first sort of chunk of your first year and you've got some idea of what's going on, so when that confusion subsides, getting your first results out and getting something happening and things working, that's a really good point where you're feeling nice and stable. So for me, I think it was that every new bit of work I did, I was exposed to a new bit of maths that I didn't understand. I had to go and learn enough to go and work out what was happening, how to understand it. So I'd sit in the office with Kevin and he would derive stuff on the board and I would just sit there and have not a clue what he was talking about. So for me, I think it was more of because it felt like a cumulative thing of becoming more and more aware of what I didn't know. Mm-hmm. Until the point where we got to the third year and you're thinking about whether you can do this yourself as a career, and wondering how your supervisor pulls all these ideas out of their head and go, look, try this instead and try this instead. It just can seem like magic, but
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know, it's interesting. And just on the PhD to postdoc transition, or even sort of transitioning from postdoc to postdoc, I feel like there can be a lot of pressure on people to move, well, institution first of all, but also move country to do sort of postdoc. Do you think that it was like advantageous to you that you moved to Paris during that time, or what would you say to people who are sort of considering whether or not they need to move country, say from a PhD to postdoc transition?
Yeah, so I'd have to say, sadly, that the move to Paris was a big step, it had a big impact on my future career. I think partly because not necessarily because it was a move to a different country, but because it was a move to a team that had a radically different approach to computational work to where I've been embedded in Sheffield. So, the reason that's often argued for moving around is for you to be exposed to different scientific mentalities, different ways of doing science. And that at least was definitely true when I moved to Paris to that team, because none of them did any kind of simulation work really. It was very much much more theory driven. So yeah, I learned a huge deal from them, and also I gave them stuff they didn't have as well, because I had a bunch of skills that they didn't really cultivate. So that worked really well. But the key things there was both, what it really was that for that Paris job, it was because it was a whole sort of new scientific environment, but also because it was a fully independent post. So you could really demonstrate that you're able to drive your own research. And then that's why it really helped me then going forward, because I could then point to work that didn't have my PhD supervisor's name on it. Then I'd go, this is definitely independent. Because as much as because one of the problems when I got a few years into my postdoc career, I realized that because I'd been carried on working with Kevin on various basal ganglia problems throughout my entire time in Sheffield, despite the fact that most of the work was driven by me and my ideas, obviously working with him, so his name was on the paper. So to the outside world, it looks for all the world like I've just carried on working with my PhD supervisor, and it's going to be very hard for me to prove that this is my work. So a key thing, the thing I advise a lot of people on is particularly making that transition from a postdoc to later on, is if you end up being in the same place for quite a while, you need to be able to demonstrate you establish independence while you were there. I think that's the key.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just looking at the chat, and there doesn't seem to be any more questions. There's no one with their hand up either. So
cool.
Yeah, if there's no more questions, I think we'll leave it. We'll leave it there. But yeah, thank you so much again, Mark. It's been a really, really great talk, and really interesting to hear all the insights that you have, and we really appreciate you. Oh, we have one very, very last minute question that just came into the chat. If you're happy, go for it, Freddie. Very last question. Sorry, Mark.
Okay, no worries. Let me open the chat now.
Well, it's quite a general question. Yeah. He can't use the microphone, so he's just typed it. I don't know if you can read it. He says, any advice for a PhD student going into a postdoc?
Yeah, lots. But I guess something specific. I guess so. I would say that obviously the way that I got from my PhD into my postdoc was unusual, right? In that, as I said, I'd left academia and I was pulled back in basically by the relative job security of a 3-year contract with a decent salary as a postdoc. So the main thing at least in the UK, of course, PhDs are, as many of you know, your stipend is not tremendous. And when I was doing it, it was half what you get now, less than half what you get now. So the step from just the PhD to the postdoc salary was gigantic. So I guess, but the key thing in when I now sort of obviously I'm recruiting lots of postdocs from their PhDs. It's sort of the reverse advice is to just reach out to people you're interested in working with. Because, yes, sure, lots of, PIs who are vaguely well known get quite a few emails from around the world, people going, oh, let's do a postdoc in your lab. But often they are not particularly personalized messages. So if you're genuinely interested in working with someone and you can show that you're genuinely interested in them just by having a short email, which shows clear awareness of their work and hence why you're interested in working with them, then they're going to be, then you've got a decent chance that they will respond. And the reason you want to reach out to them is to find out what opportunities they have, because most opportunities come up. Yeah, sure, lots of job ads will come up eventually on Jobs AT UK in the UK, and they'll come up in various forms in Europe. They'll come up on the various mailing lists if you're in a computational neuroscience jobs. But there's lots of sort of stuff it pays to just find out what's available, because often there's sort of soft money lying around because grants haven't come to an end yet, but there's nobody on the grant because they've left or something. So there's opportunities that will kind of appear. So the basic one is, figure out who you want to work with and go to them, basically. So follow-up question for Freddie. So what considerations do you have to do as a PhD student in terms of if a postdoc is right for you? Good question. So basic thing is talk to the other members of the team without the PI present. Always do that. So I offer it when people interview for me. I tell them I will put them in contact with my team so they can talk to the team if they haven't thought about this. Talk to the team about life in particularly vulnerable things, right? You want to talk to the team about what's like living where the position is if you don't know it well, and you got to talk to them. They get some genuine, unfiltered feedback from them about what it's like working for that particular PI and like working in that team. And you want to talk to more than one team member, of course, in case there's also the team itself is having some issues within it. So that's in terms of fit for you. Also, you also want to think about whether the way that lab is run is great for you, right? So some labs are really laid back and they'll have occasional lab meetings, and others have people allowed to do whatever they want, and other labs are run really like on a really strong schedule. So anyone who knows what it's like at the Gatsby Institute, and where Peter Diane was running it, though he's taken his style to his new job in Heidelberg. So they have a tea break every single afternoon, and at that tea break, everyone has to turn up, and someone has to present some work in that tea break. So every single day there is some kind of presentation. If that's too much for you, then don't do that postdoc. You prefer a much more laid back style, that's not for you. So yeah, find out, talk to the team, not just the PI, and figure out whether the way the team works is for you, as well as the science. Right? Science is only part of you're taking on the job, and the job environment is as important as the science.
Yeah, that's great advice. Even talking to team members and not just the PI, not just for starting a postdoc, but also starting for a PhD, it's also really important. So the whole way along, it's really good advice. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I just see another question coming into the chat. All the last minute questions. Is there, changing the career, is there anything or any time too late in science, from Guy?
Possibly. So in my career, I changed what I was working on when I was in Paris. So I changed from being a modeler of different brain structures to being a data analyst while I was in Paris. So now most of our work, pretty much all the work that my lab members do, is all on various forms of computational analyses of data sets. So it kind of turned into a sort of a data science lab. And that was a deliberate decision to move fields. And I realized I would need time to do it in. So it was why I kicked off when I got to Paris, was really working hard on establishing that line of work. So that was quite far in, right? So I'd done a PhD in 2 postdocs at that point, and then switched to something else. So that wasn't too late because it's worked out quite well. I guess I don't know. There's plenty of other case studies of scientists who switch to new research areas deep into their careers and have no problem. I mean, Pete Redgrave, my old mentor in Sheffield, he switched to becoming an expert on dopamine when he was in his late 50s because they had been contacted by, he was well known as a superior colliculus researcher, looking at how the colliculus controls sort of the escape responses of rats and so on. But he got contacted by some researcher who says, I found this connection from the colliculus into the dopamine system. What do you think it's doing? So they had a whole line of research figuring out that. So he migrated down to the dopamine system and started becoming a thorn in Wolfram Schultz's side about the raw prediction error theories of dopamine and stuff. So he had this late career bloom of really fantastic papers in Science and Nature Neuroscience and so on. on the dopamine system that he had no plan to do. He just got sucked into this world and read up on these papers and got these experiments underway. So yeah, I guess it's possibly nothing is ever too late, but it's about choosing your timing, right? About making sure there's enough time to establish yourself in the new thing you want to do before it becomes, before some critical juncture, wherever that be, because you've got to find the next job, or because in Pete's case, because you're going to retire at some point soon. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that was the last question in the chat. Last question this time. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much again, Mark, for the great talk. It's been really interesting. I've enjoyed it, and I think everybody else has too. So thank you very, very much. It's been really, really nice. Okay, so we'll leave it there. So thank you again, and we'll see everybody hopefully at the next event, which is next week on Tuesday. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Okay, bye all.